What if the most feared vampire king in history set a condition no woman could ever accept? Accept her? Watch as a poor, humble girl challenges destiny, love, and darkness itself. Don't miss this epic supernatural romance hit. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more addictive stories. Asterisk, a poor, humiliated girl is thrown out into the cold night. But what no one knows is that the most feared vampire king is watching her, and she is about to become the answer to his impossible condition. The night air was cold enough to sting the skin, but Elara did not flinch as she stood outside the Grand Hotel, clutching her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders. Just moments ago, she had been inside, working quietly as a waitress, trying her best to remain invisible in a place where people like her were not meant to be seen. But invisibility had failed her tonight. A wealthy woman had accused her of spilling wine on a designer dress, even though Elara had not even been near the table. A manager did not ask questions, did not care for truth, and in front of everyone, he had slapped her dignity away with harsh words and a final command to leave. No apology, no payment, just humiliation. The laughter of the guests still echoed in her ears as she stepped onto the empty street, abandoned once again by a world that never gave her a fair chance. Elara had known struggle all her life. Orphaned at a young age, she had learned to survive by accepting whatever work she could find, no matter how harsh or unfair. Yet, despite everything, she held on to something rare: kindness. Even tonight, as tears threatened to fall, she thought more about the embarrassment she caused the hotel than the injustice done to her. That was who she was, a girl who carried pain quietly and still chose softness in a cruel world. She took a slow breath, looking up at the dark sky, whispering to herself that tomorrow would be another chance. Even if she did not know how Dot from across the street. Hidden in the shadows, a man watched her with unblinking eyes. He stood perfectly still, untouched by the cold, his presence blending into the darkness like he belonged to it. He was not an ordinary man. He was the Vampire King, a ruler feared across kingdoms, admired by those who knew power, and avoided by those who valued their lives. His name was spoken in whispers, always followed by caution. He had lived for centuries, seen empires rise and fall, and yet nothing had captured his attention in decades. Until now, he had been passing through the city, uninterested in human affairs, when the scene inside the hotel caught his attention. He had watched everything unfold, from the false accusation to the cruel dismissal. But what intrigued him was not the injustice. It was her reaction to it. She did not scream, did not beg, did not fight. Instead, she accepted it with quiet strength, protecting the dignity of others even when hers was being destroyed. It was something he had not seen in a long time. Something rare. Something valuable. The Vampire King stepped forward, his polished shoes making no sound against the ground as he approached her slowly. Elara sensed a presence and turned, her tired eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something different about him, something unnatural, but she could not explain it. His gaze was intense, yet calm, as if he could see every hidden pain she carried. "You were treated unfairly," he said, his voice deep and controlled. Elara lowered her eyes slightly, unsure how to respond. "It does not matter," she replied softly. "I will find another way." A faint expression crossed his face, not quite a smile, but something close. "Most people would demand justice," he said. "Justice does not come easily to people like me." She answered honestly. He studied her for a moment longer, and spoke words that would change her life forever. "What if I told you that your life is about to change, and that you may be the only person capable of fulfilling a condition no one else in this world dares to accept?" Elara looked up, confusion and disbelief mixing in her eyes as the cold night suddenly felt heavier with meaning. She had no idea that standing before her was not just a stranger, but a king, and that this moment was the beginning of a story that would bind her fate to his in ways she could never imagine. Asterisk. When the vampire king reveals his shocking condition for marriage, every powerful woman refuses. But the poorest girl in the city becomes the only one who does not run away. Elara stood frozen as the stranger's words echoed in her mind, her heart beating faster with a mixture of fear and confusion. There was something in his voice that felt impossible to ignore, something heavy with authority and truth. She had met many people in her life, both kind and cruel, but never someone like him. His presence alone made the world around her feel quieter, as if everything else had stepped aside. She tightened her grip on her shawl, trying to gather her thoughts, then finally spoke with hesitation. "I do not understand. What condition are you talking about?" Her voice was soft but steady, revealing both her caution and her courage. The man looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring her worth beyond what eyes could see. Then he stepped slightly closer, the dim streetlight revealing more of his sharp features and calm, unreadable expression. "I am not an ordinary man," he said slowly, "and the life I live is not one that any human would choose willingly." His words carried a quiet warning, but also an invitation. Elara felt a strange chill run through her, yet she did not step back. Something inside her told her to listen. Before he could continue, the sound of a passing car broke the silence, and with it came a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The man straightened slightly, as if reminded of something beyond this moment. "Tomorrow evening," he said, his tone now firm, "there will be a gathering at the Grand Hall. Women from powerful families, noble houses, and wealthy circles will attend. They believe they are being invited for a chance to become my wife." Elara's eyes widened in shock, and she quickly realized that this was no ordinary proposal. This was something far beyond her world. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly, unable to hide her confusion. "Because none of them will accept what I require," he replied without hesitation. "And I want you to be there." His words felt unreal, almost like a dream she could not fully understand. Elara shook her head slightly, taking a step back. "You must be mistaken," she said. "I do not belong in places like that. I am no one important." Her voice carried the weight of years of being told exactly that thought for the first time. A faint intensity appeared in his gaze. "That is exactly why you are different," he said. "You do not seek power, yet you possess something far more valuable." Elara did not know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. No one had ever looked at her as if she mattered. The next evening, despite her doubts and fears, Elara found herself standing outside the Grand Hall, wearing the simplest dress she owned. Inside, the atmosphere was filled with luxury and confidence, as women dressed in expensive gowns spoke proudly of their beauty, status, and expectations. They laughed, whispered, and competed silently, each believing she would be the chosen one. Elara felt out of place the moment she stepped in, her presence drawing curious and judgmental glances. Some recognized her as a former waitress and quickly dismissed her with quiet insults. Then the room fell silent. The man from the night before entered, and this time there was no doubt about who he was. His presence commanded attention, his authority undeniable. Every eye followed him as he walked to the center of the hall. When he spoke, his voice was calm but powerful enough to hold everyone still. "You have all come here seeking to become my wife," he said. "But there is a condition." A wave of anticipation filled the room. "I am a vampire king," he continued, his truth falling like thunder in the silence. Shock spread across every face, followed by fear. "The woman who becomes my wife must offer me her blood under the full moon. Willingly, without fear, and without betrayal." Gasps filled the hall, and one by one, the women stepped back. Some whispered in horror, Others turned away immediately. Fear replaced ambition in an instant. No one wanted a life bound to darkness, to something they did not understand, not no one except one. Elara stood still, her heart racing, her mind filled with uncertainty. She knew she should be afraid, knew she should leave like the others. But something inside her refused to move. Slowly, against all logic and expectation, she stepped forward. The entire hall turned to look at her dot, and for the first time, the Vampire King allowed a real expression to appear in his eyes, not surprise, but recognition. The only one who did not run was the girl the world had always ignored. She enters the dark palace as his chosen bride, but behind the grand doors, whispers begin, because the Vampire King's condition is far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The moment Elara stepped forward in the silent hall, everything changed, not just for her, but for everyone watching. The women who had once stood proudly now looked at her with disbelief, some with mockery and others with pity, as if she had just walked willingly into her own destruction. The Vampire King did not speak immediately, but his eyes remained fixed on her, studying her calm face as if searching for fear, hesitation, or regret. Yet Elara stood there quietly, her hands trembling slightly beneath the folds of her dress, but her eyes steady. She did not fully understand what she had just agreed to, but she knew one thing clearly. Her life had never offered her safety, and yet she had survived. If this was another storm, she would face it the same way she always had, with quiet strength. Without another word, the king extended his hand toward her, a simple gesture that carried immense meaning. The hall remained frozen as Elara hesitated for a brief moment before placing her hand in his. His touch was cold, unnaturally cold, but not painful. It sent a strange sensation through her, something unfamiliar, yet not entirely frightening. As soon as their hands met, the decision was sealed. Murmurs filled the room, but no one dared to speak loudly. The king turned without addressing anyone else and led Elara out of the hall, leaving behind a crowd that would soon turn their shock into rumors. The journey to the vampire palace was silent and unsettling. The carriage moved through the dark roads, far away from the bright city lights, toward a place that seemed untouched by time. Elara sat across from him, stealing small glances, trying to understand the man she had just agreed to marry. He remained composed, his expression unreadable, as if this was nothing more than a routine decision for him. Yet there was something deeper in his eyes, something ancient and distant that made her wonder how many years, how many lifetimes he had lived. When they finally arrived, Elara felt her breath catch. The palace stood tall against the night sky, vast and intimidating, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than the cold air. It was beautiful in a dark, haunting way, with towering walls and windows that reflected no warmth. As she stepped inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The servants bowed their heads, but their eyes revealed curiosity and doubt. Whispers began the moment she passed them, quiet but sharp enough to reach her ears. A human girl, a fragile girl, a mistake. Elara lowered her gaze, pretending not to hear, but each word settled inside her like a weight. The king led her through long corridors, until they reached a grand chamber prepared for her. "This will be your room," he said simply. "You will have everything you need." His tone was calm, almost distant, as if he were maintaining a boundary between them. Elara nodded, unsure of what to say, but before she could gather the courage to speak, he added something that made her heart tighten. "There is one rule you must never break. After midnight, you must not leave this room, no matter what you hear or feel." Elara looked at him, confusion and unease rising within her. "Why?" she asked softly, unable to hide her curiosity. For a moment, there was silence. Then he met her eyes directly. "Because the part of me you agreed to accept is not something you are ready to see." The words lingered in the air long after he left. That night, as Elara lay awake in the unfamiliar room, the palace felt alive in a way she could not explain. The silence was not empty. It was watching, waiting. And as the clock slowly moved toward midnight, a distant sound echoed through the halls, something between a whisper and a cry. Her heart raced, her mind filled with questions. But she remembered his warning. For the first time since she stepped forward in the hall, fear truly found her, and she began to realize that becoming the Vampire King's chosen was not the beginning of safety, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. Asterisk on the night of the blood moon. The truth behind the Vampire King's condition is revealed, and it could bind their souls forever or destroy her completely. The palace felt different as the day of the blood moon arrived, as if the very walls carried a silent warning that something powerful was about to unfold. Elara had barely slept since her first night, the echoes she had heard after midnight still haunting her thoughts. Every servant avoided her eyes, and the whispers had only grown louder, filled with fear rather than curiosity. She could feel it in the air, a tension that made her chest feel heavy, but no one explained anything to her. She was no longer just a guest. She was the chosen one, yet she knew the least about what that truly meant. Still, she held on to her courage, reminding herself that she had made this choice, and she would not run from it. As evening fell, the sky slowly transformed into a deep shade of crimson, and the moon rose larger and darker than she had ever seen before. It was not just a moon. It felt like a presence watching over everything. A soft knock came at her door, and when she opened it, the Vampire King stood there, his expression more serious than ever. There was no distance in his gaze tonight, only a quiet intensity that made her heart beat faster. "It is time," he said simply, his voice lower than usual, as if holding something back. Elara followed him through the silent corridors, her steps steady even though fear whispered in her mind. They entered a vast chamber lit only by dim candles, and at its center stood a stone platform marked with ancient symbols. The air felt heavier here, almost alive, and Elara instinctively knew that this was the place where everything would change. She turned to him, searching his face for reassurance, but what she saw instead was something far deeper pain. Not physical pain, but something older, something that had been carried for centuries. "This is the condition," he said quietly. "Not just blood, but a bond." His words were slow, deliberate, as if he wanted her to understand every part of it. When you offer your blood under the blood moon, it is not simply a ritual. It connects your life to mine. You will feel what I feel. My strength will protect you, but my darkness will also reach you. Elara felt a chill run through her, but she did not step back. Instead, she listened carefully, her heart steady despite the fear. "And if I cannot bear it?" she asked softly. His eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of vulnerability. "Then the bond will break, and it may destroy you in the process." The truth was not softened, not hidden. It was real, and it was dangerous. There was silence between them for a moment, but it was not empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding. Elara looked at the stone platform, then back at him. She could walk away. He had given her that choice before, and she knew he would give it again. But she also saw something no one else had seen, the loneliness behind his strength, the burden behind his power. This was not just a condition for him. It was a necessity, a risk he had to take as much as she did. Slowly, she stepped forward. "I will not run," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not now." For a brief second, something changed in his expression, something almost like relief, but it disappeared just as quickly. He guided her gently to the platform, his movements careful, controlled, as if afraid to hurt her. The ritual began with a small blade, its edge glinting under the candlelight. Elara watched as he held her wrist, his touch colder than before, but strangely steady. When the blade touched her skin, she flinched slightly, but she did not pull away. A few drops of blood fell onto the stone, glowing faintly as they touched the ancient markings. The moment his hand tightened around hers, everything changed. A sudden rush filled her mind, overwhelming and powerful. She felt it all: centuries of loneliness, endless nights of silence, the weight of being feared, the pain of never truly belonging anywhere. It was too much, too deep, too real. She gasped, her body trembling as the connection grew stronger. "I can feel you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," he replied quietly. But there was something different in his tone now, something softer, something human. For the first time in centuries, he was not alone, and for the first time in her life, Elara understood that her choice had not just changed her fate, it had changed his as well. As enemies rise from the shadows and betrayal unfolds inside the palace, the fragile human girl becomes the only one who can save the vampire king from a destruction he never saw coming. The bond changed everything between Elara and the vampire king, not in loud or obvious ways, but in quiet moments that carried deep meaning. After the blood moon ritual, the palace no longer felt as distant or cold as before. Yet something else had taken its place, a growing tension that neither of them could ignore. Elara could now feel fragments of his emotions without him speaking, subtle shifts in his mood that revealed more than words ever could. There were moments of calm, moments of watchful silence, and beneath it all, a constant sense of unease. It was as if something dark was approaching, something even the powerful king could not fully control. The servants had grown more cautious around her, their whispers no longer filled with doubt, but with fear of something greater. Some avoided her entirely, while others watched her as if she held a dangerous secret. Elara tried to remain composed, continuing her days quietly, treating everyone with the same kindness she always had, but she could feel the difference. She was no longer invisible. She was now at the center of something far bigger than herself. One evening, as she walked through the long corridors, a sudden wave of pain struck her chest, sharp and unexpected. She stopped, gripping the wall for support, as her breath caught. It was not her pain, it was his. Through the bond, she could feel it clearly, a surge of anger mixed with something darker. Without thinking, she followed the feeling, her steps quickening until she reached a part of the palace she had never entered before. Guards stood outside a large chamber, their expressions tense, but they did not stop her. The moment she stepped inside, she saw him. The vampire king stood in the center of the room, his presence overwhelming, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. Around him were several figures of other vampires, their expressions cold and hostile. The air was thick with conflict, and Elara immediately understood that this was not a simple disagreement. This was betrayal. "You have bound yourself to a human," one of them said with clear disgust. "You have weakened the throne." "She is not a weakness," the king replied, his voice controlled but carrying a dangerous edge. "She is a risk," another added. "And risks must be eliminated." The words sent a chill through Elara, but she did not step back. Instead, she walked forward, her presence interrupting the confrontation. All eyes turned to her, some filled with surprise, others with quiet anger. She could feel their judgment, their belief that she did not belong there, but she did not let it stop her. For the first time, she stood not as a servant, not as someone forgotten, but as someone who mattered. "He is not alone anymore," she said softly. Yet her voice carried through the room with unexpected strength. "And neither am I." The vampires exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by her calmness. They expected fear, hesitation, weakness, but they found none. What they did not understand was that Elara was no longer just a human girl. Through the bond, She carried a part of the king's strength, and more importantly, she carried something none of them possessed. Compassion. The leader stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Do you even understand what you are protecting?" he asked. Elara met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she answered simply. "I understand that power without kindness becomes cruelty, and fear without trust destroys everything." The room fell silent. For a brief moment, even the king looked at her differently, as if seeing her not just as someone he had chosen, but as someone who had chosen him in return. But the silence did not last. "This is not over," the leader said coldly before turning away. "You have made your decision, king. Now face the consequences." As the vampires left, the tension in the room remained heavy. Elara turned to him, her heart still racing, but her expression steady. "They will come back," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied, "and they will try to destroy everything." "Yes." There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Then we will face them together." For the first time, the vampire king did not hide what he felt. There was no distance, no cold barrier, only a silent understanding that she had become his greatest strength. And in a world ruled by power and fear, the weakest girl had just become the strongest shield he had. Asterisk. In the final battle between love and power, the human girl must make a choice that will either save the vampire king forever or lose him for eternity. The warning did not take long to become reality, as the palace that once stood in silent strength soon found itself surrounded by shadows that carried betrayal and hunger for power. The rebellious vampires returned under the cover of darkness, stronger and more determined, no longer hiding their intentions. This was not just a challenge to the king's authority. It was a war against everything he had become since choosing Elara. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned tense as guards prepared for battle, their loyalty tested by fear and uncertainty. Elara could feel it all through the bond. The rising storm inside him, the controlled anger, and beneath it, a quiet fear not for himself, but for her. The attack came suddenly, like a storm breaking without warning. The walls echoed with the clash of power as vampires moved with unnatural speed, their strength shaking the very foundation of the palace. Elara stood at the center of it all, her heart racing but her mind clear. She knew she could hide, she could stay safe, but something inside her refused to let her step back while he faced everything alone. The bond between them pulsed stronger than ever, guiding her through the chaos until she found him at the heart of the battle. The vampire king stood surrounded, his power immense, but stretched against multiple enemies. His movements were precise, his control unmatched, yet even he could not fight endlessly against betrayal from his own kind. Elara could feel the strain, the weight of centuries pressing against him in this moment. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, ignoring the danger, ignoring the fear that tried to hold her back. "Stop!" Her voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the chaos in a way no one expected. For a brief moment, everything paused. The attacking vampires turned toward her, their expressions filled with disbelief and anger. To them, she was nothing, just a human who should not even be standing there. But they did not understand what she carried. Elara moved closer to the king, her hand reaching for his without fear. The moment their hands touched, the bond between them surged, stronger than ever before. She could feel his power, his pain, his endless loneliness, but this time, she did not just feel it, she shared it willingly. "You are not alone," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming force surrounding them. The leader of the rebels stepped forward, his eyes filled with cold determination. "This ends now," he declared as he raised his hand, preparing to strike. But before he could act, something unexpected happened. The bond between Elara and the king erupted with a powerful energy. Not dark, not destructive, but something pure and unbreakable. It spread through the chamber, forcing everyone back. The vampires staggered, their strength faltering as if something greater had taken control. This was not just a bond of blood anymore. It was a bond of choice, of trust, of two worlds coming together without fear. Elara stood firm, her presence unwavering. "Power without heart will always fall," she said, her voice echoing with quiet strength. "And fear will never rule where trust exists." The rebels hesitated, their confidence shaken for the first time. What they had believed to be weakness had become something they could not fight. One by one, they stepped back, their rebellion breaking not by force, but by something far stronger unity. Silence slowly returned to the palace. The king looked at Elara, not as someone fragile, not as someone he needed to protect, but as his equal. "You chose this," he said quietly, "and I would choose it again," she replied without hesitation. In that moment, everything changed. The war ended not with destruction, but with understanding. The palace was no longer a place of fear, but a place where strength and kindness could exist together. The human girl who had once been invisible became the queen who changed everything. And the vampire king who had lived in darkness found something he had never known. Before peace. Their story became more than a legend. It became a reminder that true power is not in fear or control, but in respect, compassion, and the courage to stand beside someone, no matter how different they may be. And in the end, the condition that no one could accept became the very reason the strongest bond was ever formed.